Welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on CAN TV. With me tonight is Bob Schwartz, longtime civil rights, a lifelong civil rights activist, I might add. I'm Andy Thayer, a co-founder of Gay Liberation Network. Bob knows a few things about elections, having lived through a number of them, but also as a civil rights activist, you've seen the other side of social progress and how it really is made.
That's right. In the United States, when we think of politics, the minds of most people go immediately to elections. My mind goes to direct action, such as the protests organized by Martin Luther King and others, in which I participated, which forced change to be placed on the political agenda. So one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight as we review the midterm elections is the place of elections, but what I believe both of us consider to be the more important place of direct action.
And before we get into that, I'd like to call your attention to some important anti-war activities coming up this Sunday. This Sunday, for those who don't know, is the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, Armistice Day, so-called. And Veterans for Peace Chicago are going to be doing this event, Imagine Armistice in Chicago, and it's 3 to 5:30 p.m. this Sunday, the 11th, and it's going to be down in Hyde Park at the Lutheran School of Theology. Sorry, that's maybe a little bit difficult to read on your screen. That's at 1100 East 55th Street. Another anti-war veterans event is also happening on Sunday the 11th. And this is something that is hosted by a number of groups: Iraq Veterans Against the War, Chicago About Face, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They're doing their annual Veterans Day ceremony at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's always a very moving event. It's at Wacker Drive and Wabash Avenue. And for those who aren't familiar with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, that's right down by the riverfront. So you go to Wacker and Wabash, and then you go down some stairs to right by the riverfront there. And these anti-war veterans will be talking about a number of important issues. No doubt, for example, this recent massacre in California, where a veteran, as with so many other people who've been traumatized by war, unfortunately killed at least a dozen people. And the role of violence in the society, as veterans, they're very attuned to the problems of violence in society. So please check that out as well. But getting back to our topic, what do the midterm elections mean for change? We have this, the latest edition of Windy City Times. I've got to hold it backwards there. There we go. And this is for our Facebook Live people. Change is in the air. Now, undoubtedly, when they wrote that headline, they're thinking the sweep of the Democrats in Illinois, and they're thinking change is a great thing. And all I could think was the ancient Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." And certainly the Chinese have had centuries of experience with interesting times, of warlords and so forth. And we have got, whoever would win the elections, both here in Illinois as well as nationally, there are certain structural problems. I mean, just looking here at Illinois for a moment, the pension situation is ridiculous in terms of the billions that are owed pensioners. They signed up, many of them, municipal workers who couldn't collect Social Security. This is their sole source of income, and both parties have been working mightily to try and figure out a way to dump it. I mean, Dan Biss, who is the so-called most progressive in the gubernatorial primary in the Democrats, engineered a bill to try and cut people's pensions. Right. And so, while the Windy City Times may be thinking we're getting all sorts of change, I think we have to say, look, yeah, things are going to be different. You're not going to have a right-wing ideologue in the governor's mansion, but you're going to have people using so-called progressive rhetoric to sell much more effectively the austerity, the cuts in social services, the tax increases, probably, as they always do, fall mainly on working class people.
Well, and there's been talk also of a constitutional convention.
Yes.
Which would be called, at least in large part, to take away the constitutional requirement that now makes it impossible to snatch the pensions away from state workers.
Yeah, but they're selling it by saying this is so we can introduce a progressive income tax. But really, the hidden agenda here, and we'll see how many people fall for it, but the real hidden agenda here is to break the promises made to pensioners.
Right.
Now, Illinois, in so many respects, is broke. And there are other states, such as New Jersey, which are in horrible financial shape as well. Puerto Rico is in a horrible shape and getting worse because of the brain drain of people leaving the island, the most active and the most educated, if they can get out, after the disaster of the hurricane just made things that much worse. I think if we look at the problems that we're facing solely in a local context, you can only go so far. And the thing that comes to mind to me is after the Great Depression hit, municipal governments, state governments right around the country were effectively bankrupt. They gave out what benefits they could under extreme social pressure, but they were still effectively bankrupt. It's only the federal government that could come in. Your thoughts on that, Bob?
Well, yeah, I think it's a serious situation. It's basically it's a crisis in the capitalist economic system. That's what it is fundamentally, but none of the politicians ever talk about that.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders touched upon it a little bit in his campaign when he was talking about the inequalities in our society. But this is really an issue that needs to be addressed, and the domination of Wall Street and the fact that more and more wealth is going to the people at the top, those problems are not going to be addressed by elections. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to happen.
Well, and it's not just a crisis of capitalism, it's also a crisis of U.S. imperialism, because the United States came out of World War II with half the productive capacity in the world, because most of the rest of the world had been blown to smithereens during World War II. And they were able to dominate militarily the vast majority of the globe, economically and militarily. And now the economic is gradually going down, China and other powers are going up, and yet the United States is trying ever more desperately to hang on to the portions of the world that it controls. And we all pay for that. And this is where I'm getting into in terms of the federal government, because when you have a country that spends almost as much on its military as the rest of the world combined, when you have a government which is supporting dictators and military coups around the world.
Right.
I mean, Donald Trump and his racism can quiver in fear at the annual migration of people coming up from Central America, which, by the way, it is an annual migration. It's not something that's new. But few people in the United States know that the folks that are coming from there are largely victims of U.S. foreign policy, foreign domination.
That's never mentioned.
It was the 2009 coup that was supported by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and President Obama that installed the military dictatorship, which overthrew the last freely elected government in that country, and things have just gone to worse in terms of violence rates, in terms of attacks by the oligarchs on people's rights. And so this is not just a move away from Honduras by Hondurans because of the economics. It's also a political event. People are actually marching on the capital Tegucigalpa, outside of which is, by the way, a huge U.S. military base. So you have this huge infrastructure of military domination around the world, whether in the South China Sea, where the United States hypocritically says to the Chinese, you shouldn't be here. And it's just outrageous.
Well, and here, part of the headline here has to do with the Democrats taking control of the U.S. House. Now, what it doesn't mention, but it probably wouldn't be critical of it anyway, is the fact that so many of these Democrats recently elected and those who are re-elected are corporate Democrats.
Right.
And the media has pointed out how many of the newly elected Democratic House members have a military background. And isn't this a great thing? So that the so-called defense budgets will continue to be bloated. Duckworth and Durbin, our senators, voted for more money than even Trump requested for the so-called defense budget.
And it was a record defense budget. And it should be noted that under Obama, Israel got record military aid. It's just over and over again, we see the Democrats criticizing Republicans for things they themselves do once they're in power. And so I think one of the interesting things about this past Tuesday's election was there was record turnout for a by-election, particularly among young people. I saw a stat for Illinois that young people, so-called millennials, outvoted the baby boomers for the first time, which is an unusual result. It reflects, I would argue, a false hope that many young people have, or a frustration in thinking, well, we've got to vote. And certainly there was lots of propaganda promoting voting in the run-up to Tuesday, particularly aimed at young people. And then when they see what they get, then a lot of these people are going to be very, very disappointed. It was that disappointment may not kick in until after the 2020 elections. But going back to what you were saying at the beginning of our show, Bob, it has been social movements that have brought about the changes, whether in the New Deal programs, whether in the civil rights legislation, whether in the massive social programs that were introduced in the wake of 1968. President Nixon introduced food stamps quintupled them from what they had been. We had the Clean Air, Clean Water Act. We had to wind down the Vietnam War, not because this right-wing Republican wanted to do any of those things, but because he was forced to by mass movement, which actually allowed the two of us to be sitting here speaking on behalf of gay liberation, because it was a gay liberation movement. It was birthed in 1969, coming up on that 50th anniversary next year.
One of the websites that I subscribe to is called Black Agenda Report. And the executive editor, Glenn Ford, had a very interesting response to the midterm elections. He doesn't have confidence in elections, confidence that they will change anything, and he too supports direct action. And he mentioned the fact that large majorities of people, for example, favor universal health care.
For decades they have.
Yeah, even a majority of Republicans polled favor universal health care. But the politicians are all owned by the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry, who are dead set against universal health care. So Ford was saying that a movement should be organized and I would say not only around that issue, but other issues as well. A majority of people favor peace instead of war, and yet we keep getting war after war.
Majority favor a U.S. out of Afghanistan and Iraq, for example.
Yeah, sure. So, but movements could be organized on issues like universal health care, which vast numbers of people support. But there has to be a change in consciousness, which can happen when you get involved in a movement. Then your consciousness, can change from a focus on elections to a focus on mass movements. So that's and if you want to read this article, go to blackagendareport.org.com.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the things, a lot of people on the left pointed to the Bernie Sanders campaign as a breath of fresh air, and certainly there were issues being raised there, but I think that Sanders himself was raising them in a completely disingenuous way, because it was Martin Luther King, of all people. As much as MLK is invoked by many on the left, it was Martin Luther King himself who said that you can't have guns and butter, that he came out against the Vietnam War, not just because of the slaughter of brown people in Vietnam and the lack of sovereignty accorded to the Vietnamese, but also that you can't have the social programs that he saw that were needed by poor blacks, whites, and others, while spending all this money on the military. And if anything, given that U.S. capitalism is in a relatively weaker position today than it was then, those arguments that Dr. King was making in '67, a year before he was assassinated, are even more true today than they were back then. And yet you have so-called progressive Democrats who think they can ignore foreign policy. And I think a lot of the left follows them, unfortunately, in thinking they could ignore U.S. domination in the Middle East, using Israel as a proxy for that. And it's very cynical at its worst. It's naive at best, because you can't have that kind of support for U.S. imperialism. It was Marx who said, a nation which imprisons another cannot itself be free. And it certainly was true in the 19th century and today, that the United States, if we're looking for the first-class social services we see in many poor countries, the reason why the United States has got fourth and fifth rate social services is because so much of this war spending and support for imperialism.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So the question is, what comes next? Because you have a divided Congress again, and no doubt the Democrats will say, well, we tried to do what we could, but, there's Republicans and so forth. But you need only look at the times when the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, such in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, and you can see that you had a president who moved steadily to the right. As you were saying, Bob, the vast majority of people support universal health care, and what we got instead was a very pale reflection of that.
Well, let's remember that part of Obama's chant in 2008 was hope and change, and here we see change again. And what we got was pretty much the same old thing. He ruled universal health care off the table. He said there would be no discussion of universal health care when he convened a White House conference on health care shortly after taking office. And then the public option was jettisoned. So we ended up with something that was great for the insurance companies, not so great for the people who need health care.
Well, and just to play devil's advocate for a moment, you can point to the Obama administration doing such things as very late in the day supporting equal marriage rights for LGBT, some transgender, actually fairly minor reforms for trans people. But I think you have to say that that was only a result, frankly, of a couple decades of struggle for equal marriage rights, for example, when Obama infamously flip-flopped from being in favor of equal marriage rights to opposing them right in the heat of the notorious Proposition 8 campaign. Now, there were certain gains that didn't cost the system, that didn't cost the government a whole lot of money. But I think you have to say that, while we support those gains, the vast array of things that many people would want, and Trump played to this in terms of working class demands for a stable working class incomes, played the race card and other jingoistic things. Nonetheless, there was the failure of the Democrats over the preceding 8 years to actually address those things that gave that bigotry an in. And here in Illinois, where we have a solidly blue government, that they can't point to anyone else as the problem, and we're going to have probably a whole heck of a lot of austerity coming down the pike in this state, which will only in turn feed the bigotry again. And I think it's, for those who are young, who haven't seen a number of elections, I think it's really important to take a few steps back and look at how we got a Donald Trump. Because we have literally, since the Bill Clinton administration, had a Democratic Party that, in spite of many people, opposing war, supporting universal health care and so forth, we have had a Democratic Party whose leadership has steadily marched to the right. And as a result, the Republicans themselves have moved further to the right so as to not lose their franchise, to the point where we've got open white supremacists supporting the Republican Party and welcomed into the party. And that's not just a function of the Republicans becoming so right-wing, but the Democrats, by saying that they're in favor of ending welfare as we know it under Clinton, and the effective death penalty bill, and other very retrograde, pack the prisons legislation that Clinton favored, has moved the entire train of the politics in the United States to the right.
Yeah, well, I was listening to a TV talking head the other day. I can't remember his name. Cenk Unger or something like that. But anyway, he's considered
No one watches television.
He's
anyway,
considered
right?
one of the liberals on MSNBC. It's not clear to me whether he was fired or whether he still had his program.
Okay.
But he was being interviewed on one of the C-SPAN channels, and he was advocating for progressive policies. But he was saying, and we've heard this before, that the Democrats can be forced to become progressive. Now, let's spend a minute, and we don't have too much more time, but there are reasons why the Democratic Party is not going to be pushed in a progressive direction. It's been tried many times before. Bernie Sanders...
You'll get progressive rhetoric.
Yeah.
We'll give them that.
Yeah, progressive rhetoric, but because of the way the parties are organized, and because of their dependence on corporate funding, in spite of occasional talk of the small contributions matter, they don't. It's the corporate funding that matters. Both parties are owned and operated by Wall Street, so there really isn't any opportunity for the Democratic Party to be reformed.
Well, even in the unlikely circumstance that you were able to take over the Democratic Party, and this has happened once in U.S. history, think the McGovern anti-war campaign, the very corporate backers you speak of, Bob, totally pulled all their support and gave Richard Milhous Nixon what was to that point the biggest landslide victory in U.S. electoral history,
Yeah.
in the presidency and so forth. So you can, in the extremely unlikely event that in spite of people like Hillary Clinton and Donna Brazile putting their fingers on the scale of what's supposed to be a fair process, if in spite of that you take over the party, you'll have taken over a corpse. And I think you have to take 2 steps back and look at the history of this government, which was responsible for the mass extirpation of Native Americans, which was responsible for the mass enslavement, the mass of African Americans, the mass deportation of Mexican Americans during the Great Depression, the mass incarceration under that liberal Roosevelt of Japanese Americans. I mean, over and over again, how many times do you have to see through whether coups, wars, breaking of their own democratic rules, this government will reach to any means fair and foul, no matter how brutal, to maintain their power. And you think that they're going to respect an election which takes away that power? Are you kidding me? I mean, what kind of fairyland do we live in? Do we think that the people who are so craven for power, who use it to support some of the worst corporations who kill people and so forth through their products and so forth, that they would just willingly give up their power? So we have to build on our own power. And as we saw in the sort of movements that forced FDR, the 3 general strikes in 1934 that happened in this country, the mass occupations of the factories that began largely in 1936, as well as the power of the civil rights movement in the 50s and early 60s, the black power movement in the late 60s, early 70s, the gay liberation movement, the women's liberation movement, any number of movements that have forced politicians of both parties to do our bidding, at least to an extent, is really the way to go, rather than pour millions of dollars into the already wealthy parties. I mean, it's obscene how much money was spent on this last gubernatorial race, even though it was mainly rich people's money.
Well, Pritzker spent $180 million. I mean, that is obscene.
No.
But the one positive thing about it, in my view, is that it points to the problem of corporate control of the electoral process.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have that as our last note before we wrap up with a few quick announcements here. First, in terms of an anti-war veterans event happening down in Hyde Park here. Check out the event that's being held by the Chicago chapter of Vets for Peace, and that's going to be happening this Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m. and it's again down on 1100 East 55th Street, and then of course a number of groups, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the Iraq Veterans Against the War, Chicago About Face are going to be having an anti-war Veterans Day ceremony, 11 a.m. Sunday, November 11th at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and so check that out. And with that, we're going to wrap up the show. Thank you for all who participated and helped make this possible.